was a cold winter evening, and silence was spread all around. A chilling breeze was blowing through the trees. George, a 17-year-old black teenager, was standing in the middle of the graveyard where his father was buried. He remembered just a day ago how different his life was. His father was with him. They talked and laughed while working, and suddenly there was nothing. His life has suddenly come to an abrupt halt, and the emptiness. He felt like the purpose of his life was vanishing in the air. The sound of his father's words, laughter, advice, screams, everything was still ringing in his ears, and that dark face with the light of love and innocence was still in front of his eyes. Tears were falling from his eyes, but his expressions were bleak. Why? That single word was haunting him ever since his father's demise. He wanted to crush the whole world, scream his lungs out, scratch the grave, and take his father back. But his face of him and the innocent smile, there till the very end, was holding him back. He was the one who should be killed, not his father. Then why? He wanted to be killed along with him, but not yet. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, he remembered his father once told him. He nodded in denial and fell to the ground on his knees. That bullet didn't kill me, Dad, but it didn't make me strong either. Why did you do that, Dad? You deprived me of all those hopes which I have built. What should I do now? I am lost. I have no idea what to do. Guide me. I am in pain. I am in pain, he murmured with a broken voice. And in response, no voice came except the rustling of leaves and branches. But in the back of his mind, he knew what his father would have said at this moment, like he always used to say. Always remember, my son, this pain, this life, these hardships, these people, everything is temporary. Don't let them get in your way and affect you. Your kind behavior, your kind words, and all those good deeds you have done for people will be the only thing of worth. He sniffled and rubbed his eyes. You got to get up and make sure not to give up on yourself, even if there is no one to keep your back steady. You are my pride, son. You are the hope for your mother and sister after me. Will you promise me to look after me? Yes, Dad, I will. He remembered their conversation after his father was diagnosed with cancer. Those past statements strengthened him and encouraged him to do what was right and what he promised. Wiping his face, sending some last prayers towards heaven, he moved towards the exit, walking past the empty junkyard near his home, where his father used to work, reminded him of those good days when he learned a lot of new things. They would laugh together and discuss the complications of life. He used to show him fundamental moral values and human worth through his acts. The way he treated, talked, worked, and behaved with people and animals around him was the model he had always followed for years. Not even a single person in his life had any complaint to him. Everyone respected him due to his upright character and kind nature. He used to teach his son about work ethics and management so that he would be appreciated among people just as he was. When he entered the small home with a shabby interior, it was dark outside. His mother was lying on the bed, looking at the roof blankly. Silent tears were leaving the corners of her eyes and falling on the pillow. His little sister wept while hugging the only photo they had of their father. When his mother noticed George entering the room, her silence broke and turned into muffled, painful cries. She got up from bed and hugged her son. I knew sooner or later we would be separated from your father since he had cancer, and I prepared for myself for that day. But yesterday's incident broke all my expectations. George wasn't prepared for that. She cried on his shoulder. No one was, Mom, he whispered while crying back. I never thought the cause of your father's death could be anything other than cancer. He did nothing wrong to anyone. Why did he kill my Ray? He was a cop. He was supposed to be with justice. How could he kill a person? He will be punished for what he did. I will make sure of that. Rage and fire were burning in his eyes. The whole incident playing in his mind again and again. His father, unfortunately, developed societal cancer of racism, hatred, and greed. This cancer is far worse than any cancer. Since he buried his father this morning, he had decided to fight for his father's rights against the societal cancer of racism and corruption. He determined to take Lieutenant Schwan Cooper to the gallows for his heinous crime and had enough evidence. A day before, a blue tow truck entered the junkyard premises, and before it could go any further, an officer from inside the place came and motioned Mr. Raymond was in the driving seat to stop the vehicle and come down. George was sitting on the passenger seat beside his father, observed the unusual activity. They both came out of the car and went to the officer, standing all proud and straight with raised eyebrows. George looked around and found no worker was there in the junkyard. That was strange because usually everyone was around this time in the morning. Out of nowhere, an assistant officer, besides the lieutenant, stepped forward and handcuffed Mr. Raymond without questioning or charges. This action caused a sudden panic and shock for both Mr. Raymond and George. "What are you doing?" George asked the sergeant, who was pushing and pinning down his father and putting on cuffs forcefully. "Sir, can you please tell me what I have done to deserve this behavior?" Raymond asked the lieutenant while trying to cooperate with Sergeant. "Shut up, you drug-selling moron. You want to talk? We'll talk in jail." The lieutenant spoke curtly, making them anxious about what was happening. "Sir, you must have some sort of misunderstanding. I have never been associated with drugs in any way, let alone sold them to someone." Raymond explained himself to the lieutenant. Meanwhile, the sergeant moved to the truck, took out a nylon bag and underneath his jacket, and threw it inside the car. Unfortunately, George saw him throwing it. "Hey, Dad, what are you doing? What did you throw inside?" George tried to get his father's attention and looked suspiciously at the sergeant. "Oh, we must be misunderstood? Really?" The lieutenant continued the conversation, stopping Mr. Raymond from looking behind and listening to his son. "We have got the tip that you are a drug dealer. Check the truck, sir." "Wait a minute, sir. I saw your officer throwing a nylon bag inside." George spoke more loudly to get everyone's attention this time. A floating expression of contempt appeared on the lieutenant's face, but he hid it perfectly. Raising an eyebrow, he confidently addressed, "That was a nice trick to distract us, but I'm not a fool. Check the truck, Sergeant." "I'm not using any tricks. Sir, I saw this man." "Sir, a packet is found." A sergeant came with a brown cuboid packet cut from the center, revealing boxes of drugs inside. The glint of cunningness in his eyes as he achieved his goal. "You found? You liar! You put it there yourself!" George lashed out, not believing what was happening. "George, calm down. Let me talk." Mr. Raymond tried to hold back George with cuffed hands. "Hey, you, the tiny little bug of a drug seller. How dare you call my officer a liar? You want to get arrested along with your father?" "My father did nothing wrong, and you have no right to arrest him. Your sergeant throws the nylon bag before my eyes, and he's lying." The lieutenant came near George and, looking right into his eyes, spoke as if challenging him. "Do you have any evidence to prove what you saw?" And at that moment, George knew it was all planned. But what he couldn't understand was why they were doing it. Mr. Raymond, who had been observing the lieutenant's disgust towards him, understood very well why they were trying to do it. You have planned this all yourself?" "Why?" George asked. "George, stop this. You must be mistaken." Raymond tried to close the argument because he didn't want George to face the consequences of any situation. "Me? Did what?" Lieutenant asked with a smirk. "How could you do that? You are an embodiment of justice. Why are you playing this illegal act and blaming it an innocent person?" George couldn't believe it, because the world was too simple for him. First thing, we are not answerable to any of your foolish questions. Secondly, if you said one more word against us, you will also be arrested. You can't take him. I will tell everyone you are a fraud and a cheater, George shouted while the sergeant was dragging his father to the police car. Sure, tell if you lived that long. The lieutenant laughed and took his revolver and pointed it towards George. George was at his wit's end, suddenly pushed to the ground, and heard a shot. Moments later, he saw his father lying on the floor with blood oozing from his chest. Everyone went still for a moment, and when the realization hit them, they went into action. George was crying and trying to talk with his father, who was lying unconscious. The lieutenant immediately called the control room and sent a message to the station. One culprit found in drug selling died in an encounter in junkyard situated north of Finkel Street. Send the Team 3 for immediate inspection. 1 week later, Sean Cooper, a son of a famous business tycoon, Albert Cooper, who served as a lieutenant, is being dragged to prison after a hearing in the courtroom. According to sources, it was proved through evidence that he murdered Raymond Harrison and allegedly blamed him for drug selling and falsifying the evidence. As per charges against him, he has been deprived of his position and badge, and the court sentenced him to life imprisonment. A news reporter outside the courtroom was speaking on the television in a small house where Mrs. Raymond and her children were sitting. They were watching the news and shedding tears on the justice provided to their departed soul of Raymond Harrison. Furthermore, it has been come to notice that evidence was provided by the son of Raymond Harrison, named George Harrison, in the form of a videotape recorded from the black box of an unidentified car in the junkyard where the victim's body was investigated. The confessionary statement of ex-Sergeant Billy Wright clarified evidence, which explained that all those allegations against Raymond Harrison were nothing but a pre-planned execution due to racial hatred and greed for promotion. Court has sentenced him to 7 years of imprisonment for hiding the fact and causing hindrance in justice. The censored evidence video was being broadcast on the news. George turned off the television and served the food on the small table where they were all sitting. Come on, let's have these banana pancakes in the memory of Dad. Just when they were going to eat, a black car stopped outside their home, and a well-suited older man entered their home. George welcomed him inside and offered him a seat. He looked around their small house and then introduced himself. I am Albert Cooper. My condolences will not be sufficient for your loss, but I would like to apologize and compensate for your loss. I am sorry to say this, but you cannot bring our father back, and you do not need to apologize. What your son did wasn't your fault, George replied. I know I can't bring your father back, but since, due to the ill nature of my son, you lost your father, the least I can do is to make sure you live a good life. And for that reason, I would like to give your family my whole wealth. We appreciate your concern, but we don't want all this aid. My children and I will be able to manage through thick and thin, so you don't have to worry about that, Mrs. Raymond replied humbly. Look, Mrs. Raymond, I insist. That way, a burden from my heart will be lessened a bit. I believe it was my responsibility to keep a check on my son, but unfortunately I couldn't. Now, in compensation for that, I want to see your children brought up under good care. That way I can die with a little ease, at least. Consider it an appeal of an older man with little time to live. In the end, good deeds are all that matters. George looked into his eyes at once. Those were the exact words his father used to say. Something pulled inside his heart, and he slightly nodded his head in acceptance. Mrs. Raymond wasn't expecting this from him, but stayed silent. While seeing Mr. Albert off, the only thing in George's mind was that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, one way or another. This is what life is, unpredictable.